you're almost welcome, even if virtually, to UCD Dublin. Again, I'll just note at the outset that this event is being recorded for publication on UCD social media channels. We're delighted to have you with us today for this launch of the publication of Stefano Marcuzzi's latest monograph, The EU, NATO and the Libya Conflict, Anatomy of a Failure, which is published by Routledge. And this is the fruit of his 3-year Marie Curie Fellowship here at the School of Politics and International Relations at UCD. Stefano took his DPhil in military history at the University of Oxford in 2016. He went on to a Max Weber Fellowship at the European University Institute, and currently he's an analyst for the NATO Defence College Foundation in Rome and adjunct fellow here at UCD. Now, to comment on the book and its findings, we are just delighted to be joined today by two very distinguished scholars. Dr. Christina Bache is an adjunct professor in international affairs at the Brussels School of Governance and a research affiliate at Queen's University Belfast, just up the road from us here. Previously, she was a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science and visiting fellow with the Wilfred Martin Centre in Brussels. Her research fields are in security, peace building processes, and conflict resolution, and she's a regional interest in North Africa and the Middle East. We're also delighted to be joined by Dr. Karim Mezran, who is with the Atlantic Council, where he is Senior Fellow and Director of the North Africa Initiative and Resident Senior Fellow with the Rafik Hariri Center on the Middle East. There, he works on processes of change in North Africa in general, with a very specific focus and interest on which he's published extensively on Libya, the transition in Libya, and North Africa more generally. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of our speakers to make their individual presentations in turn, and then we're going to have an open Q&A session to close out our hour, which I think promises to be a very fascinating one. So without any further ado, it's over to you, Stefano.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all of you for being here. Thanks to UCD and to the Irish Research Council, particularly to you, Ben, because you essentially made this project possible in the first place. Now, the book, as mentioned, looks at the Libya crisis through the lenses of the two major Western-based international organizations that interacted with that crisis, so NATO and the European Union. Of course, NATO played a prominent role in 2011, whereas the EU committed itself to supporting Libya's reconstruction. But the book also looks at why the EU failed to take the lead in the anti-Gaddafi intervention of 2011, and also evaluates NATO's approach to Libya after 2011. So, first of all, I think it is important to remember that the anti-Gaddafi intervention of 2011 was initiated under the responsibility to protect, or R2P concept, which intrinsically included the R2R concept as well, responsibility to rebuild. So in this sense, both NATO and the European Union, the two organizations that supported the interventions with different means, but still both of them supported the intervention, they had a moral obligation to help stabilize the country. But that was never done, as everybody knows, and Libya in fact descended into not just one, but two further civil wars in 2014 and 2019. So I think this is a failure for which both NATO and the European Union, at least to a certain degree, are responsible. Now, to appreciate the roots of that failure, we need to start by digging into the 2011 operation. Because many problems in the management of the Libyan crisis in the past decade are a direct outgrowth of the issues that had emerged from the 2011 operation. Particularly, there was complete disconnect between what some NATO member states wanted, namely regime change, and what the organization as a whole planned for, which was a predominantly aerial campaign to protect civilians. And this led to a situation where individual member states, namely France and Britain, pursued a number of initiatives parallel to the NATO operation, including the arming and training of Libyan militias and the deployment of special forces, which are seen internationally as a violation of the mandate, and which in turn alienated local support, and particularly from regional players, the African Union, and also global support from actors like Russia. There was also tension between NATO and the other partners of the coalition, because this was in fact not a classic NATO operation, but rather it was a UN-authorized international intervention led by NATO and using NATO assets, but the political direction was not given to NATO. It was given to a Libya contact group made of a number of different players. And that meant that NATO did not exercise political oversight of non-NATO members, some of which, especially the Qataris and the Emiratis, played a critical role in arming and training the rebels in Libya. But this, in fact, strengthened peripheral forces at the expense of unifying Libyan forces. It exacerbated intra-Libyan divisions and tied specific militias to foreign patrons that would later use that leverage to wage a proxy war in Libya. There was also division between the political and the military arms of the alliance, which, as everybody knows, impeded any serious planning for the day after the end of the operation. And finally, NATO did not operate at NATO. As I said, it was not a classic NATO operation. Only half the allies participated in the operation, and this allowed most allies to drop any responsibility towards Libya in 2011 and since. So that is the consequence of a lack of a true institutional commitment. Again, this was a coalition of the willing, essentially. So it depends on the will of the participants. So the way the operation was conducted created the situation and also the dividing lines along which Libya broke in subsequent years. And I think we'll hear more about that from Karim. Now, the EU stepped in after the war to help stabilize Libya. It did so through its classic toolkit of assistance, financing, and training and development programs. And the years that followed are essentially a story of a short circuit between Libya's foreign policy paradigm or model, largely based on soft power, and the needs of a hard security crisis. And I think we'll hear more from Christina about this. Now, interestingly, both NATO and the European Union have, in the last couple of years, published documents from which we grasp that their understanding of their own problems in the management of the Libyan crisis are to be attributed to member states' divisions. Indeed, we did see very serious divisions among the EU member states, especially Italy and France, and also between NATO member states, particularly France and Turkey, over the Libyan dossier. And in the latter case, you may remember that French and Turkish vessels came close to a military confrontation in the summer of 2020 over the issue of implementing the arms embargo, the UN arms embargo in Libya. And yet, I tend to dispute this idea that EU or NATO crisis management can be understood only against the yardstick of member states' interests, or that divisions among the member states are the main problem or the only problem. I mean, they're part of the problem. They're certainly part of the problem, but in the book I posed greater attention to the role of the institutions themselves in shaping EU and NATO policies and on the impact of operational cultures and instruments. For example, in the case of the EU, the EU was in fact united on a number of occasions in Libya. The EU is the international organization that launched the highest number of initiatives after 2011, including one CSDP mission, U-Bound Libya, and two CSDP operations, Sophia and Irini. Results were poor, to say the least. And I argue that this was the case because what the EU and also NATO suffered in the aftermath of 2011 is a strategy problem, not merely an institutional problem. So we'll conclude with this a final remark on the strategy issue. Essentially, the main strategy problem that both organizations had in Libya was how and why to use hard power in a fast-changing crisis like the Libyan, especially when it came to deter local or international spoilers of the Libyan political process and their own hybrid tactics. Well, the first component of this strategy problem, common to both organizations, is the lack of knowledge of the host country or the operational theater, the joint operational area, according to NATO language. A second problem identified is more political and cultural, actually. It's a legitimacy problem. So when to intervene, especially with hard power, and in the case of the EU, a difficulty at conceptualizing the utility of hard power in world politics more broadly. So the lack of knowledge problem includes some basic intelligence gaps on Libya's human terrain. There was, for example, a serious misunderstanding of the 2011 conflict in Libya, which was too hastily labeled a revolution against a tyrant, whereas in fact, I think it was a civil war. And I also prefer the term uprisings, plural, to the term revolution, because the term revolution, especially in the context of the so-called Arab Spring, exaggerated the Western view of the anti-Gaddafi movement as being united and democratic. And so it influenced, it encouraged an overly optimistic view about the aftermath. There was also a lack of institutional intelligence, especially on the part of the EU in this case. The European Union 2012 strategy paper for Libya encompassed a number of assistance programs. But assistance programs were not what Libya needed. I mean, they were fine enough in the short term, but in the longer term, what Libya needed was economic institution building, reforming the corrupt and partisan economic institutions, which were used as resource allocators to buy off the loyalty of social or tribal segments of the Libyan people. They were used in that fashion since King Idris, really, and even more so under Gaddafi. So the EU also failed to understand that Libya didn't have the institutional and technical capacities to absorb EU financial programs. So a significant portion of what was promised was never delivered. So we can speak of a mix of hubris and ignorance here. Then the legitimacy issue, the issue also has a twofold component. Namely the desire by both NATO and the EU to operate under a UN Security Council resolution, or following the local ownership principle, so following a Libyan invitation, an invitation from the Libyan government. Now, on paper, these are very good principles, but in reality, both turned out to be problematic in Libya. This is possibly the most uncomfortable finding of my book. You know, as a matter of fact, the UN Security Council is paralyzed. It's paralyzed by actors, chiefly Russia, but increasingly China too, who grasped the possibility to impede EU or NATO action in Libya, or to diffuse the impact of their action by setting impossible mandates for Western-led operations. Clear example of this is the mandate for EU Operation Irini, adopting the principle of compliant boarding to conduct inspections on vessels suspected of transporting arms into Libya. And the principle of local ownership also turned out to be problematic because, you know, it's quite difficult to elaborate a strategy based on local ownership where the local owner is in fact a fragmented puzzle or enjoys very limited legitimacy domestically, or has legitimacy but has very limited power on the ground. And also the principle of local ownership was itself weaponized by some Libyan factions, in some cases possibly instigated by their foreign patrons, in order to maintain a zero-sum game from which those factions were profiting, but most Libyans suffered. And this reinforces the need for hard power. You know, the Libyan crisis essentially has different strands, many different strands. But this book shows that security is key, really. I think there is an ongoing debate about this. There is an ongoing debate that resembles the chicken and the egg. So, you know, should we prioritize political or economic or social or security aspects? My book reveals that a certain level of security is a precondition for successful economic and political developments. So again, controversial as it might sound, as it might be, when we talk about security, we need to talk about hard power. And so NATO in particular needs to conceptualize how to use hard power, how to face hybrid threats emanating from a scenario characterized by legitimacy voids. Because I think many future crises in the broader MENA region, possibly in Central Africa as well, are likely to resemble the Libyan crisis in the fragmentation of the political landscape and in the legitimacy void. So just what do you do if if you need to play a role, if you need to deter or defeat a hybrid threat emanating from that scenario, where you can't simply train a partner to do the dirty job, because you might have no reliable partner to train. And the EU, I think, needs to learn to use hard power to uphold its normative nature or the norms it champions. And hard power is not necessarily military power. Let me stress that as well. It can also be sanctions. But again, the EU failed badly to use those as well in Libya. And so by dismissing the use, or at least the threat of kinetic force against the spoilers of the political dialogue, and also by using sanctions inconsistently, the EU delivered a message to local and international players, local and international actors alike, that unilateralism in open violation of UN resolutions could be pursued with impunity in Libya. So this is a classic example of a situation where failing to act assertively when necessary aggravated the crisis. The result was greater suffering for the Libyan people in the first place. And I don't think that's a normative policy, quite frankly. I call it an unjust, a profoundly unjust policy and an unjust outcome. So with that, I would open the floor to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. And I warn you now, I'm gonna ask you a question about learning from that experience, and a big question mark as to anything as to whether or not anything really has been learned. If we look at EU policy towards particularly Libya since the military intervention. But let me hand over now to Christina. Christina, we look forward to your comments.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. Stefano, I greatly enjoyed reading the book. I mean, a huge congratulations to you. You can see how much hard work and effort you've put into the manuscript. It's incredibly well researched. And for me, I greatly appreciated reading it because it included a multitude of perspectives. I think for me that really, it made the book and the read very appealing. It was not dry. It was much more almost entertaining in the sense. And I think that it certainly has relevancy to other multi-stakeholder engagements in fragile and conflict-affected environments. So certainly there are many lessons to be learned. Whether or not multilateral institutions take them into consideration is, of course, another question. But for me, as someone who works on human security, gender, and conflict sensitivity, there were probably 4 themes that stood out for me in the manuscript with regards to the limits of soft power. And the first would be that, as you talk about normative ideals or normative frameworks and ideas, or even traditional inclusive economic development frameworks, I think that there are limitations to them. And also, of course, there's risks of those normative ideas being securitized or even abandoned completely by political expediency and, of course, short-term containment-oriented perspectives. And I think with regards to the management of irregular migration in the case of Libya, I think this is of grave concern because it allows for populist, anti-migrant political parties, voices, movements, however you want to name them or group them, to driving that, to those driving the agenda. And also, of course, it drives those issues such as the protection of vulnerable groups into the hands of spoilers, into the hands of smugglers, and into the hands of corrupt government officials. So I think for me, that was one concern and one kind of theme that stood out to me, and of course, continues to be very relevant in today's situation with regards to irregular migration in the Mediterranean. And the second would be that soft power approaches risk being watered down because structural issues such as corruption are deemed or appear to be too difficult to address. And so I think I don't remember which page it was, but at one point you mentioned that the use of sanctions on individuals wasn't deemed a good route because it could potentially offset the power dynamic on the ground, or that it may, or is just too difficult to address in terms of attaching those individuals to to tangible corruption cases. But of course, we know that corruption and the lack of rule of law remain two of the most significant barriers to inclusive peace and development. So there again, we risk limiting the positive impact that soft power measures may have. And then on the practical side, disjointed efforts, short-term project cycles and funding mechanisms, overly bureaucratic institutions, and non-flexible funding pools are some of the practical hindrances to more effective soft power mechanisms. And then the fourth point would be, which is something that I think could be kind of taken from the manuscript and run with for future research, would be in the absence of robust gender, conflict sensitive, and do no harm approaches, that those in the absence of those types of approaches also risk limiting the positive influence or positive impact that soft power may have. So not only does it limit the positive effect, but it also may result into unintended negative consequences of soft power. And then if I could just briefly mention the Turkey-Libya dynamic, I think we had talked a little bit about that, and that's something that I found really fascinating and I think could also be developed further in a future manuscript, at least I would appreciate it. Is that I think for folks who are interested in the Turkey-Libya dynamic, of course, we know that Turkey has had a longstanding economic relationship dating back decades with former Libyan governments. And I think we can see that initially the AKP government was apprehensive with regards to regime change or to actively supporting the overthrow of the Gaddafi regime, in part because of that commercial dynamic and commercial economic investment that the Turkish private sector had for quite some time. And indeed, after the 2011 uprisings, we could see that more than 100 Turkish companies and more than 25,000 Turkish employees had to quickly flee the country because of the physical security situation. And we can see, fast forward to today, and we can see that Turkey has tried to consolidate its influence on economic and hard security matters, not only to position itself within the country, but of course to use Libya as a kind of stepping stone to the Sahel, to the North Africa and sub-Saharan regions of Africa. That also relates to trying to assert its territorial claims in the Mediterranean, of course, gain a stronghold on gas reserves and so forth. But I think it'll be interesting to see for me how the political and security landscape evolves in Libya to see how that actually impacts Turkey's position within the country. And I think it should also be, or it shouldn't be underestimated, the kind of fragility or the grave fragility of the Turkish economy and the capacity of the Turkish private sector to remain engaged in Libya without having any tangible economic guarantees that it will have a tangible return on its investments, considering that it lost so much after 2011. And I think the other just last point would be also about whether or not the Turkish private sector actually invests in the local labor market and whether or not it will be able to demonstrate some sort of actual tangible positive security conditions in its military presence in the country. Those would be my thoughts. Again, congratulations, Stefano. Really, really job well done.
Thanks very much, Christina. That's some fascinating stuff. I really do want to come back and then maybe have a conversation later about that normative orientation you talk about, both for the EU and NATO and its credibility, but also that issue with respect to Turkey, I think, is a fascinating one, and again something that I definitely take away from that text. In as much as looking at the range of regional interests and regional actors, it wasn't just between the West and Libya. There were so many dynamics at play, both within Libya and externally to Libya, that it was as Stefano has said, a real puzzle in terms of the number of actors and the number of pieces in play. Karim, I'm really looking forward to your contribution. The floor is yours.
No pressure whatsoever after your day. Well, thank you very much all. I just already went beyond the congratulations to Stefano for an excellent work and work much needed. I enjoyed and I agree with word by word what Christina said. It's a very readable academic founded book, which is almost a contradiction in terms, because usually academic books are not readable. Well, you made a readable academic book. I would enjoyed reading this one as much as I enjoyed reading your previous book in Italian, the one on the Libya Civil War, on your authority Bache. Really, congratulations. But I should say, as I said before, my congratulations will go more to the mentor of the student who did it, because we always forget the hard work that a professor or a mentor or a follower or a first reader of a PhD dissertation does in order to make that PhD dissertation a book, as it has happened in your case. So my congratulations to Ben, very much so. Having said that, you guys gave me a headache because you raised so many issues in this book. So I was scribbling quickly some notes, and now I don't know what to say. You asked me to talk about the 2011 and the perception of the situation from a Libyan point of view. Now, I cannot claim to talk about the whole of Libya or to represent by any far the majority of the Libyans. But what I can present is the notes or the point of view of someone that was very involved in it, that went to Libya for the last 2002, 2003, almost every 2 months I spent a month in Libya. I believed the way the regime was opening up, or the way the things were, as long as you did not get involved directly into politics, Libya was becoming a very livable, a very nice place. So when I was among those that were sure that either through Saif al-Islam or some other ways or the regime would sooner or later open up. What we were not expecting was the revolt. And I agree with you. I would call a revolt. I would never call it a revolution, because what we forgot and we learned only at the end of it was that Gaddafi had a lot of consensus. It was its fight of no the Libyan against dictator and his mercenaries, but there was a lot of Libyans who were after that excluded. So and then they went back into the fight. So that I agree with you. It's defining a civil war or something close to that is much more correct than defining it a revolution. Although the product was that of a semi-revolution, in the sense that the long-standing regime was overturned. So at the beginning of 2011, as a Libyan outside of Libya, I was totally excited. I was really, finally, the people are surging. There are revolts in Benghazi, there are revolts in Mezran, there are beginning, some revolts in the mosques in Tripoli, in another major city. So it was happening. And I was totally in favor of the foreign support. I was among those who said, yeah, but please intervene. There was, at that moment, as I told you, Stefano, one time when you interviewed me, I had some suspicion at the beginning. Because for the first time in my life, I was capable of checking the news that were coming firsthand. So I started immediately realizing the very first days that there was an Al Jazeera total hegemony on the news that were coming from the country by spreading voices about massacres or killings and the brutal reaction of the Gaddafi force that were not happening. I would say that a massacre in Tajura market. I called them, there's nothing here. People being massacred, protesting on the road to Sabrata. And then my relatives, many relatives, go there and then there's nothing. The common graves with a picture that came out in every newspaper. Or remember the common graves in Tripoli, Apertura Repubblica, and many other newspapers, first page. And there was a picture taken years ago of the cemetery with the grave that every day the custodians of the cemetery do in order to host the new one. So there was a totally protection for false flag. So I began to wonder what was really going on. And not this perception that does not go into any conspiracy. Just give you the perception why then there was little allegiance to the foreigner, and then there was little allegiance to the political class that first emerged, because that's something we tend to forget. Libya is fragmented later on. At the beginning, it was not. At the beginning, the perception was yes, they are fighting city by city, but that's because that's the nature of the thing. It happened spontaneously. There was no structured army. So that was the excuse we were giving why there was groups in Misrata, creating militia Misratas, various militia fighting, each one of them separately against the regime. The point is that once NATO intervened, and you explained it perfectly, the dynamic, so I won't go to that. Our perception was Italy was not into it. Definitely, it was Italy. If you remember, Italy that forced the addition to the NATO command. Italy was not in agreement because Italy did not know what was going on, but know it better than the Americans, who had no antennas on the ground. So the Americans believed what the French and the British, to a much smaller extent, were telling them. So the perception we had was the Americans were dragged in reluctantly. The Italians forced the adhesion because they wanted to be part of it, because they saw that they would be the great losers. And we understood immediately that it was not a right to protect him. For as Libya, we saw the regime change as the main target. Now, some of us were not content about it, in the sense that if the foreigners forced a regime change, and Gaddafi has his consensus, he might resist, and he might have split Libya into sides, one with the regime, one with the rebels. So we were thinking about maybe if we can foster a negotiation. So some of us I went to Washington, some went somewhere else, and tried to convince people to institution, and we found a shut door. It was a closed door. There was no negotiation. Whatever being undertaken uselessly by Bache, the guy of what's his name? I forgot the Jordanian guy that was the beginning in charge by the UN to do some mediation. The African Union did something, but it was really in the hands of single countries, of single powers. At the beginning, I thought it was France, Italy, the United States that were playing the games. And then immediately afterward, I started seeing after a while, when I could go to Tripoli and talk to people there and to leaders of the revolution, and I realized that there were other countries looming on the back of the horizon, including at the time a giant role was played by the Qatari, not as much as by the United Emirates, but by the Qatari. Qatari played a major role at the moment of the revolution, which led us to think then is it going to be an Islamist-led revolution, and that created all the other problems of on the ground of people trying to, and that was one of the reasons why it was also fragmentation, because nobody knew who was behind what, and therefore everybody said, not knowing what's happening, I'm keeping my weapons, and then let's see what's going to happen. I'm going to play a role for my part, for my group in that direction, in that other, and that was to lead to fragmentation. But as I said before, at the beginning it was not like that. So we can condemn or accuse, the accusation is NATO and the EU and the United States and company for not having had a plan for the year after, for not having a plan for the reconstruction. The EU for the weakness of its reconstruction plan, as Christina perfectly explained. Let me be nuanced in one point. The way I saw it was not only that the foreigners did not want to, the foreigners would have liked not to. Therefore, most of them, except for France, who was enthusiastic to join, but was pushed back to a certain extent. The others were very happy to hear, and this is the point, to hear the Libyans at that time united, because we're not separated on the political level. The political class at the moment saying, no, we don't need you foreigners. We are united, we are a homogeneous country, we are all relatives almost. Libya is 4 or 5 million people. 6 million is an exaggeration, but let's say 6 million, as they say, and full of money, full of oil. We are all eager to join democracy. We're all eager. And if you remember, at the beginning of the battles, remember the picture of Benghazi Square at the moment of liberation, when Weidman, the guy from CNN, goes there were no Islamist flags. There were only people. If you review those footage, the picture from the people were screaming, CNN, USA, they were all in favor for what was happening. And there were no Islamist flag, nothing like that. So that was kept on the back. That was kept because they knew that they would have divided the group. So the perception that they wanted to give is that of a united revolt, militarily fragmented for obvious reasons, not our fault, but we are all united. We are all one people. We are all homogeneous. We can do that. So don't come. We really don't need your intervention. We will solve our problems later. Thank you for helping us getting rid of the regime and its mercenaries. But for the rest, we will take care of it. That's who I really blame. Much more than I blame the foreign. I blame the first political class. I don't want to name names, but you all know all of them. And these people, in my opinion, I think badly in this case. I thought because they did not want to have any supervision on how they were going to run the country. The first political class thought they could easily manage the military differences and keep their hands on the cash, on the safe, on the wealth of the country and divide it among themselves. In groups, in families, in clans, the way the country is divided. But that was the idea. We take power and we manage. We don't need foreigners to supervise us. We don't need foreigners and we welcome the EU economic help as long as it's under our conditions. That's what you call the legitimacy question, which is perfectly there. I'm sovereign. You recognize me, so I don't want you up until you come at my own space, at my own pace, at my own speed. So that is where I put most of the blame. So once you have a recognized government that comes in, as the National Transitional Council was, who tells you, no, don't worry, there is no need for you to stay. The Americans were more than happy not to stay. The Americans the Italians, they say we don't need to stay. The only one who were a little bit upset were the French, who lost the advantage that they had. And that's why at the beginning they were upset with this, but they tried to influence immediately the new government. The first government, the provisory, was led by Prime Minister El-Kib. If you remember, what is the first thing he does? And that's what makes me think that I'm right in having this kind of bad thoughts. He pays the militias. He's the guy that appeased the militias. The guy you think that, okay, I don't have an army. I have a political unity behind me. That's fine. We're all in agreement, including the Islamists at the beginning were on board because they felt minority. But once they realized they had the military power, then that's when when we are going to have the 2014 civil war, etc., etc. But in the beginning, they were perfectly into that, and they operate in such a way that let's solve the military problem. How do we solve the military problem? We cannot force them into one army, but we don't have the power to do it. We can buy them. I remember very well the debates within the Kib government, and they said, we buy them, we give them money to be good, to stay put, to help the government to progress and to build a new government, new democracy stuff. That was the failure of what later other scholars called the appeasement moment, and that was it. That's the second step. The first time was entrusting the Libyan political class to tell the foreigners not to come in. The second one was to appease the militias. The third one was to ignore what they knew about the country, because they knew that there were divisions. They knew that the country needed to be refounded. The national identity of the country needed to be retold, retailed. The narration of national identity and all the theories you know better than I do, so I don't have to go through that. But the elite had to recompose it. Instead, they did not fail to recognize that, and they allowed the militias and their political supporters, or the other way around, it depends on how you want to look at it, to dictate the conditions of how to proceed regarding pluralism and opening up and all those nice words that in the West everybody liked. They went to elections. And that was the capital fatal mistake that the new government, the new political elite did. Because the election did not lead to a solution of the problems. They led to the crystallization of the divisions, the crystallization of the problems. And you know, after that, you have 2014, you have Mezran, and the collapse of everything. Then I agree with what Christina said, the lack of intention, of strength of the Europeans to do even in hard power what others were doing, that only cooperated in creating the fragmentation that we have now, the proxy war or semi-proxy war that we have, and all that followed. After that, it was like a slavine, it was a rolling ball. You couldn't stop it. And before I forget it, I like to say one thing on your observation, Christina, about the Turkish intervention. There's a parenthesis. The Turks intervened because the others didn't. We have to say the Turks did what the Italians should have done. So despite the economic interest, the political interest, all true, I agree with everything. They hesitated at the beginning, but they were pro-Gaddafi. I know because I knew a lot of Turkish entrepreneurs that were doing business in Libya under Gaddafi. So the fact that hesitation was, oh, where am I going to lose something? And then when they saw that where the wind was blowing, they joined. But the real involvement of Turkey was on when Serraj went there in 2019 and asked the Turks. No, but I called the Americans, I called the Germans, I called the Italians, I called the French, I called the British. Nobody replied. Can you help us? Can you help us? And the Turks were the only one who replied. And this is something that was fundamental. Until that moment, the government, the people in Libya were not ready to call the Turks in. Were not ready to. They would have liked to see a foreign intervention. They would have liked to see an American intervention. They were even ready for an Algerian intervention to support them, to offset what the Egyptians and the Emirati were doing through Haftar. But when nothing of this realized, then when they called the Turks saw the opportunity, grabbed the opportunity. So I may be mistaken. I don't see them a very long-term strategic starting from 2011. I see them starting getting involved in Libya much later, and then tackle the opportunity to obtain both things: the treaty for the maritime borders, which was important to them, but also the possibility to, under a good flag, called by the national government, recognized, to help the civilian people of a country that were being slaughtered by a military foreign aggressor backed by foreign power. I mean, all the cards were there for them to do it. Nobody else is coming to your help. The people that have a treaty with you are not coming, so I'm coming. And they gave the Turks enormous popularity in Tripolitania at least. And now the way they're behaving now, it's not bad. They're out of the situation now. They're not getting involved into what's going on. They're saying we will support whoever the Libyans decide is the government. And their armies and their forces are there. They're watching. They will prevent a major military clash. I'm sure they will. But they will not be the ones who dictate if it's going to be Hamid Dbeiba or it's going to be Fathi Bashar. They will wait for the Libyans to decide it. And then they will impose their control over whoever comes in. Because they are the only ones that are really there with their weapons. They're really there with the hard power to say to the militias, you don't move. The Italians are not. The French have been kicked out. The Americans don't want to do it. The Russians are there, but in a much limited way. And I don't think they will be allowed to go further than that. Because also within the coalition, you're having some people who are seeing the Russian alliance as negative, not as positive. Now that the international system is shifting. So I think that I can conclude here. I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of points, a lot of ideas, a lot of doubts. I hope during the Q&A I can be able to at least to reach the level of those who have preceded me. Thank you very much.
That's tremendous, Karim. Thank you so much indeed. And I have to say, and Stefano will recall, one of my ongoing themes as he worked on the book, and I looked at iterative drafts thereof, was the complexity of the local political dynamics, and trying to keep track of all of the different stakeholders was, for a non-specialist, a real challenge. But I think one of the successes,
even for a specialist.
But one of the successes I think of Stefano's book is precisely that it does allow you to follow that complexity and to understand the significance and importance of precisely those local dynamics which played out within the conflict. Yeah. So thank you very much for that, Stefano. I just want to check before I open it up to questions from all of us. Are there any points from Christina or Karim that you want to come back to or expand on or clarify?
Maybe shall we see if there are any questions so I can answer maybe more than one together?
Fair enough. Well, I'm going to start.
I already have your own question, so let's see if there are any further comments or other questions, and then
absolutely
I collect them and then.
Cool. Well, I've got a couple to add onto my list, but and if anybody else has a question, just either indicate wave or put your little hand up in the corner. I've got two questions. The first is for Stefano and Christina, and that question effectively revolves around the normative myth. A lot of what NATO and the EU tried to do was justified in terms of normative orientation and ambitions for the region, in terms of peace, in terms of security, in terms of human rights, in terms of democracy. And I guess my basic question is there any evidence that normative orientation motivated policy change on the ground as the crisis was initiated and was deepened? So is there any credibility in the claims on the part of the EU and or NATO for that normative orientation? And then I have a question really for Karim and then both Stefano and Christina, if they want to add on to it. And that is, was the intervention itself an error? In other words, was the intervention itself a bad idea? Was the intervention a good idea, but badly executed? Or was the intervention a good idea and successful in as far as it could have been, bearing in mind the conditions that you outlined, Karim? Because it's again, we come back to this, and in the contemporary security situation, a lot of people point to the Libya intervention as one of the rationales on Russia's side, for example, to say that ambition for regime change really tore up the rule book and gives Russia license to do what it is doing. So I really want to come back to that first principle question about the intervention itself, its legitimacy, and its utility. Other questions from anybody else in the hall? Yeah, Mariana, please.
Hi, Stefano and Christine and Karim. Thanks so much. I have not read the book yet, but very much looking forward to. My question to anybody who would like to answer it. So this point on both NATO and the EU needing to learn how to use hard power in these hybrid conflict situations where we lack clear, legitimate actors. I'm wondering, do you think that the current strategic security reassessment following the invasion of Ukraine is going to lead to any kind of reassessment of what NATO and the EU have been doing on that front in Libya as well? Or it's two completely different situation scenarios and you don't think there's going to be any trickle effect of one into the other? And the second question has to do with this member states versus EU institutions tension that you referred to, Stefano. And because you mentioned that the EU lacked the institutional intelligence at the time really to know exactly who they were dealing with, how to intervene, and so on, I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that was responsibility of member states with the expertise like Italy, like France, to come in and support a little bit these institutions? And to what extent do you think that the competition that there was between Paris and Rome and others prevented this sort of synergy between member states and institutions, which I see at play even now with Operation Irini that you referred? So thank you so much, all three of you. This is really, really interesting.
Thanks, Mariana. Any other questions to add to the list? What I propose then, we've got about 10 minutes left. What I propose then is I'm going to go in reverse order. So I'll start with Karim, then Christina, and in order to give Stefano the last word, which I think is appropriate in the circumstances. So Karim, any of those questions you want to pitch in on?
Well, yours is particularly challenging, I think, because even when I think about it, and I've been thinking about it a lot, it was a good idea, in my opinion. I still think, despite all the contradictions that it brought, I still think that it was good that NATO and some foreign powers showed interest in preventing the massacre of the civilian in Benghazi. There is a preliminary question. Was really Gaddafi going to massacre the civilian in Benghazi? We will never know. We will never know. I have my father who's the only one who said Gaddafi would have never done that. Other people who say, no, he was ready to do that and slaughtered them, he said it. This is a chicken and egg situation. We are never going to get out of it because it didn't happen, thank God, so we don't know what's going to happen. And the second preliminary question is, were all these foreigners ready to do it to defend the people of Benghazi? And even if they wanted a regime change, was it for the good of the people or was it for their own interest? And this is the second preliminary question, which we will never be able to answer. Were the French really there because of French reasons, or they were there because of humanitarian, because somebody said they lost the control of what happened in Tunisia, so they wanted not to be flanked by Libya. So these are questions that don't pollute any answer that you can give about was it a good idea. Now, externally and superficially, I say it was a good idea. It was not even badly executed. It was not executed entirely, which is, I agree with the very simplistic explanation that Obama said when he said, my worst regret not having continued. Because at that point, once you are there, for whatever reason, you had the duty. I sent my soldiers to fight, and I don't care about the French or the British. I'm going to leave Libya, which is I broke the toy, I fixed it. So I'm going to fix it. That was this kind of sense of responsibility that I would have expected from my country, for a superpower, at the time even more than today, like the United States. They were involved in Afghanistan, Iraq. But Libya, that's Libya is a joke. It's not compared to Syria, compared to Iraq, compared to Afghanistan. That does not militarily does not present any one of the difficulties of these other countries. Libya at that time in 2011 could have been fixed with 5,000 soldiers, or even with the threat of using a battalion of Marines. There is no militia at the time that would have not stood in guard and would allow it. They could have a plan to take back the weapons, to reorder the army, and it would have, and I'm sure it would have worked at that time. 6 months later, a year later, was so totally different for the reasons that both Stefano, Christina, and I have listed below. I hope I've answered.
Thanks very much, Karim. Christina, yourself.
I would just mention that Stefano refers to the 2012 EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy that called on the EU to always include human rights perspectives in the planning on its missions. And so I would say that that's even more so, or one report, there are of many, I suppose there are many more that I've also read since 2012, but it's even more of a reason for the EU to incorporate robust gender conflict sensitivity and do no harm approaches in any of its foreign interventions or foreign missions. And really take stock of the issues that arise from having those kinds of perspectives, because it would require the EU to adjust itself accordingly and to not pursue these sort of normative myths, because they do actually have the potential to have unintended negative consequences. So not only not having a positive impact, but actually destabilizing the environment or context in which they're meant to have a positive impact on. And I think that also is demonstrated in the EU's approach to migration management. I mean, we see these ongoing discussions with the EU, not only with Libya, but other authoritarian regimes like the Turkish government. And I would have think that has implications for regional instability to pursue those kinds of discussions with authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, thanks very much. So Stefano, lots there to grapple with. What are your final words?
Yeah, so I'll try to cover all the points that were left out. So first of all, I wish to stress that when it comes to lessons learned, there is a huge difference between identifying lessons and learning lessons. So, for example, a number of lessons were identified by the EU and NATO, but then the way they interpreted them, at least as far as we can grasp from their documents, so they are emphasizing the need to promote coalitions of the willing within those organizations to either speed up action or to bypass the veto power of uninterested or self-interested member states. And this, I think, can be another example of the organizations learning the wrong lessons, because, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, the fact that NATO mobilized partly in 2011 was a big problem. It was a key problem in the lack of institutional commitment that could have allowed for a significant and more serious and consistent day after commitment to disarm the militias and do all the other things that Karim mentioned. So again, this is a tricky point. On the question of intelligence, I think we need to remember that Gaddafi had brought about a huge insularity. Libya was really isolated. It's been under sanctions, international sanctions, until the 90s and throughout the 90s. And really, the European Union didn't have a delegation. They were discussing with the regime about opening a delegation, but they really lacked the very basic information. And I'm not sure that the member states had much more than that. I mean, Italy had a little. The French certainly were not much better posed. The Maltese were quite in a good position in terms of intelligence, but of course Malta didn't have the political weight that would have been needed to actually be heard in that militarized crisis. And Italy, you might remember, it was the end of the Berlusconi era. So the political strength of Italy was really very, very limited. It was unable to actually be heard in the forum. And then about what lessons for the future. So I think one point is for both the EU and NATO to try to have a more political role. So that means to play a political role in the wake of the UN, if there is a UN mission on the ground, but independent from it to a certain extent, in order not to be incapacitated or paralyzed by veto players in the UN Security Council. So I think this is a key problem both organizations need to, and their member states as well, need to address. But again, that requires adopting a more political role, whereas both the EU and NATO have tried, at least in Libya, tried to operate merely through technical tools. They even envision their own operations, CSDP operations, as mere technical tools in the hands of the UN, with the consequent problems that I have mentioned. And then another problem is about the need to include an enforcing and monitoring mechanism of any future peace talks or negotiations or ceasefire negotiations to essentially follow up from what is agreed among either the local players or the international players, because we saw that a lot of players played a double game. So they signed treaties or agreements, and then they boycotted them under the table. Now, one may say that, you know, pushing for an enforcing and a monitoring mechanism in a situation like the Libyan, but there are a lot of factions that, as Karim very correctly said, are not interested in getting any oversight, discourages negotiations. But in fact, in Libya, the opposite occurred. Because there was no such mechanism, the actors on the ground engaged in fake negotiations. They were not serious about negotiating their ceasefires and so on, because they knew that nobody would have taken them accountable. So they engaged in fake negotiations, both in 2015 at Askirat, and even more so in 2019, 2020, early 2020, when Haftar went to Moscow and so on, which opened the gates for the Turkish intervention, by the way.
But even before, sorry to intervene 1 second, but even before, all the fake negotiations that Haftar participated to and the international community both, that led to the attack over Tripoli in April 2019. You are perfectly right. These have all been pretextual. These have all been gaining of times. And those of us who are saying it were really shushed because there was only a diplomatic solution. That was the dogma of the community. While those who were searching for a military solution were unhindered by anyone else. Sorry for...
Yeah. No, absolutely. You were just reinforcing what I was saying. So those negotiations were only useful for the parties on the ground to recuperate and arm themselves better and prepare for the second round of a military escalation. And I think a final point is, which is, you know, very useful even on other fronts. You know, take autocrats seriously. It was enough to listen to what Haftar said publicly and to the Western media and in public rallies across Libya to grasp that he was going to take Tripoli by force. It was enough to listen to what he said, to what he promised to his own people, to the way he mobilized his personal army. It was not necessary to wait until he fired on the capital when the UN Secretary General was visiting. You know, and so learning about how to interact with dictators or autocrats, of aspiring autocrats, I think it's something that the West more broadly and more specifically the EU needs to do.
Well, there's some obvious lessons there too, Stefano, in terms of the contemporary situation.
Yeah.
Listen, we've come to the end of our time. Can I do two things? Can I first of all thank both Karim and Christina for not just the generosity of their time, but the generosity of their engagement in really looking at the issues and really bringing to us, I think, a fascinating insight, not just to what the book is telling us, but to the Libyan crisis more generally and the lessons to be learned and to be drawn therefrom. But secondly, can I pay particular tribute to Stefano? We had 3 years together in the most extraordinary times of COVID, which imposed so many limitations on where you were able to go, what you were able to do. You're constantly reinventing sort of the process behind the postdoc, but you've come up with a book that's a triumph, Stefano, and it is a triumph, a testimony to you as a scholar and a testimony to you as an historian, and now I would like to say at least partly a terrific political scientist.
Thank you so
much.
I
second that. I second that.
Yeah, congratulations.
So without further ado, thanks to you all. Thanks to you, to those who've joined us, and every possible success to Stefano in the future. God bless.
Thanks to you, and nice meeting you guys.
Everyone.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.